Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our talk. I'm going to be presenting a work titled Heard It Through the Gitvine, an empirical study of tool diffusion across the NPM ecosystem. And this is a joint work with Asher, Daniel, Christian, Heather, and Bogdan. It is well known that software engineering automation tools have known to benefit developer productivity and software quality. However, as we can see that certain tools get adopted more and quicker than the others. On this plot, we plot different tools with their contagiousness level. And this contagiousness basically is a pseudo for how quickly these tools spread and got adopted by different projects. But why does this happen? How do these automation best practices spread? And specifically, for slower adopting tools, how can we facilitate mechanisms that lead to faster spread and more widespread adoption? In the past, multiple qualitative studies have been conducted studying adoption of software engineering tools. Developers, when they were asked about the adoption practices, have hinted at social influence and observability as a key factor. However, what explains the differences in the adoption rates of these tools is still unknown. With the advent of social coding platforms such as GitHub and the inherent transparency incorporated in these platforms, we have a unique opportunity to observe the adoption of these automated tools. Most of the repositories indicate whether they have adopted this tool or not by incorporating a visual badge in their README file. Tracking these README files could allow us to measure which projects have adopted these tools or not. But it's not just about the tools. These platforms also give us an opportunity to see how and through which channels are these tools being spread across different projects. The larger overall question is, how many developers must be exposed to a new tool or technology, and under what conditions before it catches on and is adopted in mass? But more specifically, what we are interested in is what channels or other means of signaling adoption influences the tool diffusion the most. And our study is aimed at answering this. To be specific, for this project, we are studying diffusion of these tools, where the quality assurance tools are referred to as innovations and the projects or the repos are considered as adopters. We quantitatively want to model these tool diffusion factors. We basically want to answer the question that is related to the observability of the tool. As to how visible are these tools before developers finally adopt it. And to that end, we compare different information diffusion channels that are afforded by the platform that play a key role in this adoption process. One of our key contributions is that we pursue a longitudinal network perspective that we generate from the activity data. So consider this as an example. We have 5 repositories over here, and we'll go through the trace data or the activity data and try to incorporate and try to give you an illustration of how we incorporate a network from this. So Alice commits to repo R1 at time t1, followed by Bob, who makes a pull request for R2. Carl starts watching repository R1 at time t3, and Deanne commits to R2 at time t4. Note that we have gone through 4 rows of the activity data, but we haven't introduced any edge between repositories. But at T5, when Alice commits to R2, we introduce an edge between R1 and R2, specifically from R1 to R2. And this is because of Alice, who when starts contributing to R2, could be a potential carrier of exchange of ideas between R1 to R2. Similarly, when Carl starts committing to R3 at time t6, we introduce an edge between R1 and R3. And this edge is mostly a watcher edge because Carl was a watcher in R1. Similarly for Bob, when Bob starts committing to repository R4, we can see that we introduce a pull request edge from R2 to R4. And we also introduce a reverse edge when Deanne also commits back to repository R1. We introduce a reverse edge from R2 to R1. As you may have noted, the edges that we had introduced so far were all because of users who have contributed in certain fashion to both of the repositories. But there are also other ways by which edges could be introduced between repositories, and these could be dependency edges. So in this plot, we also introduce edges between from R6 to R3 and from R6 to R4, because R6 as a repository is dependent on both R3 and R4 and could see the actions and the activities that are happening on R3 and R4. Note that the dependency edges are not time dependent, but are time invariant. This unique perspective helps us capture observability through multiple channels, and finally test our hypothesis whether if the stronger the connection of a project is to other projects that adopted a tool before it, the more likely is the project to adopt that tool. And to this end, we designed the study. In summary, what we do is we track 12 popular quality assurance tools from 4 different classes, which are namely continuous integration classes, dependency management tools, code coverage reposers, and cross-browser testers. And we also included certain other control badges in our study. We collected 86,000 NPM repositories on GitHub, and we measured the adoption of these tools on these 86,000 repositories. Followed by, for each of these tools, we model this spread using a proportional hazard model. Therefore, each repository, we model their time to adoption. One thing to mention over here is that we are not starting from scratch. A popular sociology theory called diffusion of innovations presents various factors that contribute to the adoption of an innovation. We have so far just discussed observability, which is how do adopters get accustomed or get knowledge about these tools. But there are other factors as well, which are namely compatibility, crawlability, relative advantage, and complexity. And we will discuss all of these factors in the future slides. Another key contribution of Rogers' theory is that there is a key characteristic difference between the users who adopt the innovation in early stage and compared to later stage. Early adopters and in our paper, we also conduct some analysis
we also try to characterize this difference
whether this characteristic difference also exists
forward by Rogers'
in
theory
the adoption of tools
in the setting of
adoption of tool settings. As said earlier, observability is just one key factor that lies in the larger context of 5 factors that Rogers proposed, and we, in our study, try to test out all 5 of them. Now we discuss certain results, and the more details or the deeper dive of all of the results are in the paper and in the supplementary. First, we discuss about observability. The observability on GitHub could come from multiple channels. That is, either it could come through social network ties, which include committer ties, pull request ties, or watcher ties, but it could also come from technical network ties, which are basically dependency edges. Another thing that could also contribute to the observability as a factor is the global adoption of the tool. That is, how popular is this tool in general? When we test out the theory whether the committer network ties play a significant role or not, we discovered that number of active neighbors in the committer network graph has a strong effect for all of the badges that we studied. And same holds even for technical network ties. That is, the number of active neighbors in the dependency graph has strong effects for all tools. While studying the global adoption of the tool and adoption for a focal repository, we also observed a similar trend. For global adoption, we check the effect of number of projects that have adopted the given tool before the current time. These observations lead to implications for tool developers to promote their tools. The first suggestion is that you should try to make your tools visible through multiple channels, such as badges or through integrations or webhooks. The second implication is that you should try to advertise your tool as much as possible through Twitter, conference, friends, or even any other external medium. Most importantly, this is not about selling tools, but promoting good practices across the ecosystem. In our work, we also study other factors as proposed by Rogers' theory. The next factor that we study is compatibility. And compatibility basically tries to answer the question, how well does the tool match the project context? An example of it is a continuous integration service and a code coverage reporter would be unusual in projects which do not have automated test suites. And to measure if a project is compatible with a tool, we compute latent tool-to-project similarity. But how do we describe similarity? One of the definitions we use to define whether two repositories are similar or not is to see the overlap among their dependencies. That is, if two projects are dependent on the same set of repositories, then we can say that they are highly similar. To quantify this metric, we use TF-IDF-based cosine similarity score to measure the overlap. As you can see in the example, RotateLog and Asuka projects both have 3 out of 4 repositories that overlap with each other in their dependency list, and thus we assign them a score of 0.95. And we introduce edges between the two repos only if they're highly similar. That is, the score is greater than a certain specified threshold. Another way of measuring if two projects are functionally similar is to measure how similar are their README files. As you can see in the example, we have two repositories which have very identical README files, and you can see they're also very functionally similar because there are plugins for the same JS library. We use TF-IDF-based cosine similarity score to measure the similarity between the READMEs and introduce an edge when this score is greater than a certain specified threshold. Now, what we want to do is test out if what is the effect of these technical network ties. And we can see that description-based similarity is heavily significant to govern the adoption of the tool. And we see very weak effects for dependency similarity, but we do see them in the positive direction. And thus we conclude that a project is much more likely to adopt a tool when similar projects have adopted the tool before, eventually indicating that a good context fit definitely matters. Other factor that is also very interesting is trialability of the tool. The trialability measures how available is the tool for experimentation. Since we only study freely available tools that integrate with GitHub readily, we can assume that trialability to be a really constant in our study. Next factor we analyzed was complexity. That is, how much effort is required to adopt a particular tool. We compare quality assurance tools that are generally highly complex in comparison with communication tools that are generally of low complexity. We specifically study the effect of adoption for Travis, Cover, and Coverall's badge, which are highly complex tools to integrate, against downloads and license, which are of low complexity. We notice that all the other factors that contribute to adoption are nearly identical for both sets of tools. And based on this observation, we can conclude that complexity of the tool doesn't really affect adoption significantly. This could be viewed as good news, since additional complexity, tool complexity, is not a limiting factor, thereby again underlying the implication that it is better to invest in promotion and increasing visibility. We also studied other factors such as relative advantage, and the results of which are in the paper. But to summarize, we discovered that lack of competition amongst tools is really helpful and prompts the adoption. We also measure and study key characteristic differences between early adopters and late adopters. We discovered that early adopters generally have higher social standing and more technical experience in comparison to late adopters. Another observation that we made from our analysis was that familiarity with including badges also helped. That is, if a project has included a badge previously, then they are more likely to adopt a new badge as well. To conclude, we provide strong empirical support that social science theories of adoption of innovation, including Rogers, also hold for software engineering tools that are used throughout the NPM ecosystem. We've also observed that probability of a tool's adoption is actually proportional to the amount of exposure that that tool receives through social network ties. And that leads to clear-cut implications for software and tool developers. The first is a very obvious one, which is make tools more visible. Make it more visible through badges, GitHub integrations, or external platforms. But one key thing is that you need to expose this to more users who have higher social connections. And one of the ways to do that is to launch a viral marketing campaign which takes into account some of the observations that we have made in our study. The third important thing was that complexity of a tool doesn't seem to be a barrier at first. To summarize, we set out to study what drives adoption of tools and practices. And to that end, we conducted a large-scale longitudinal analysis of diffusion of 12 quality assurance badges on NPM. We discovered that observability was the key, even for both social and technical network ties, and good fit of the project to the tool really helps, and the tool complexity was not a barrier. And we provided empirically validated foundation for researchers and tool builders to promote tools and best practices in teams and their ecosystems. And thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us.